Rachel, please, you can start.
Good morning, everybody. Okay, so myths, misnomers, and misrepresentations. Unpicking targeting. I'm quite excited that I got one of the 2 tickets to talk about targeting, because I think if there's 2 hot issues in social protection at the moment, one is targeting, the other is conditional versus unconditional cash transfers. There's a never-ending debate about both of them. Everyone's got a view. Some of them are really deeply entrenched views about both issues. And I was trying to think about why. Why are we so obsessed with these 2 issues within social protection? And I think that it's because they fundamentally tell us something about what we think about poor people. They tell us something about the fundamental ideological positions that underpin what we do on social protection. And we can't escape those ideologies. We all have them. But I think quite often with targeting, we try and pretend that we don't. We try and pretend that we're doing something very technical, something administrative. And so what I want to do today is contrast the fact that we pretend we're doing something technical with the fact that we take really strong positions on social protection. We make strong arguments about social protection and targeting. And we even lobby very, very hard for certain kinds of approaches to targeting. And the one thing that starts to frustrate me, particularly within all of this lobbying, is the fact that quite often we see a lot of what I would argue is inappropriate analysis, manipulative analysis, misrepresentation of what we actually know about targeting. And so I was talking to my team about this, and we were thinking about a useful thing to do might be to unpick some of those myths, some of those misconceptions, some of those misnomers, and so on. And in my team at ODI, we came up with a set of 3 misnomers, 3 myths, and 3 or 4 misrepresentations of things that we know about targeting. And so what I'm going to do is talk you through those 11 things today. So, let's move on. I'm clicking this. There we go. Now, some of the words that I'm going to use, misnomers, myths, misrepresentations, are maybe not things that people who don't speak English as a first language really understand. So I'm just going to run through them really quickly. So first of all, misnomers. I've looked it up, dictionary definition. Something that's a misapplied or an inappropriate name for something, or an inappropriate designation, or an error when we name a person or a thing. So that's what I want to talk about, errors that we make in naming things or defining them in social protection. The second one about myths, traditional or legendary stories. We get a lot of those in social protection. And things that become true even though they don't have a basis in fact. We see that a lot. And then, invented stories, invented ideas, invented concepts. And then finally, misrepresentation. This one's a bit easier to understand, but representing something incorrectly, improperly, or falsely, or representing something in an unsatisfactory or an inappropriate way. So that's what we're going to focus on. I tried pointing over there. I've gone the wrong way, sorry. Okay, so the first misnomer that I want to talk you through is actually universal versus targeted. We set these things up in opposition. And when I was trying to think about how to make this presentation interesting or exciting, I started talking to Mike Sampson yesterday and saying, what if we had a debate? What if you and I stood here and argued about universal versus targeted? Might wake us up, might be interesting, might be exciting. Because people get divided into these 2 camps on targeting of social protection. People get labelled as universalists, and I think it's fair to say that Mike is labelled as a universalist, right? And other people get labelled as poverty targeters. And I like to think I'm neutral, but I think that behind my back people will say that I'm a poverty targeter. Is that also fair, Mike? Yeah. Mike calls me a poverty targeter behind my back.
I call myself neutral.
Okay. Yeah. We both think we're neutral. We're probably not. But then I started thinking a bit about this idea that there are these 2 positions. And I started thinking that that's a misnomer in itself. It's too simplistic. And I started asking myself, is it true that having a universal approach, a universal entitlement, and having targeting are absolutely mutually exclusive? And that's the first thing that I want to challenge today. And actually, Simone gave us a really big hint towards this yesterday. When he talked about Brazil, he told us that while social rights or entitlements or guarantees are embedded in the constitution, so there is a universalist principle in Brazil, they also have means testing of their programs. So in practice, we see these things operating side by side. And I think part of the problem here is that when we say universal, in theory we might understand what it means. It means a guarantee for everybody in society. In practice, universal quite often gets dumbed down to something else. It gets dumbed down to age cohort targeted. So we talk about universal pensions, but actually a pension itself is targeted depending on your age. And similarly, it gets dumbed down to social categorical targeting, targeting people who belong to a specific ethnic group or caste group. And we might say universal benefits for scheduled tribes and castes in India. That's absolute targeting. There's no question about it. And so there's a problem about the way that we use particularly the term universal in theory and then in practice. So that's the first misnomer that I wanted to talk us through. I've gone the wrong way again, sorry. Okay, the second one, community-based targeting. One of the things that I'd argue is that when we're talking about targeting, we fail to differentiate between two different and discrete activities. One of them is deciding who is going to be eligible. The second one is going and finding those people and getting cash or food to them. One of them is a policy decision, a very ideological policy decision. The second one is a practical, technical, administrative exercise. And what happens with community-based targeting is we get confused between those two things. And so I have a question for you. Is community-based targeting what we do when we allow a community to set the criteria for eligibility in a program? Or is community-based targeting when a higher body, for example the government, sets the criteria and then asks the community to deliver? Now what happens in practice is that it's the latter. Okay, so governments tend to impose on communities and tell them what the criteria are. Now maybe that's fine, but maybe it's not. Because in my view, it leads us to another misrepresentation. And that's that when communities decide to ignore what they've been told to do by government and ignore the criteria, for example, in lots of countries when they decide that instead of having 100 households in their village getting $20 a month, they're going to have 300 households in their village getting $8 a month, something like that. What do we say about that? Well, I think all too often we say that this is elite capture, that it's dilution, that it's corruption, that it's leakage. Okay? And I'd like us to stop and think, is it really? Is another interpretation of what happens when communities change the criteria for themselves, signifying engagement in the process, buy-in from people within communities into social protection programming, real participation. And when you start to get those kinds of things, we know that programming is more effective. And I'm not saying that communities are perfect and that you don't get situations where people take resources from the poor and give them to the rich, but I am saying it's not as straightforward and clear-cut as that, and that we need to think about community-based targeting in a different way. So, misnomer number 3. I mentioned this idea of leakage a moment ago in the previous slide. We have language for talking about the things that go wrong with targeting. We talk about errors, and we tend to talk about inclusion and exclusion errors. And there are problems with that language. One of the things that happens if you have a means testing or a proxy means testing system that relies on algorithms is that people start to get confused between inclusion and exclusion errors and type 1 and type 2 errors. And I've heard that sometimes we get in, that there is that tangle in Indonesia. The second thing that we also have is a real difference in the way that people use the terminology of leakage and undercoverage. It's very popular terminology, particularly in lending institutions. Technically, undercoverage is the same as the targeting error of exclusion. So people who are eligible for the programme but are not receiving benefits. Technically, well, that's what it means. Similarly, technically, leakage is an inclusion error. People who are not eligible but do get benefits from the programme. In practice, that's not what leakage means. In practice, leakage means corruption. Okay? They're actually two really, really different things. And if you talk to somebody in the street But and in particular, if you talk to somebody in the media or you talk to parliamentarians or politicians, they don't understand leakage to mean an inclusion error. They understand leakage to mean corruption, theft, diversion of resources. Okay? So I think we need to be really careful about that one. Similarly, in practice, undercoverage doesn't mean an exclusion error. When you talk to people about it, they tend to understand it as meaning not having enough program resources to cover everybody who's poor. And what you then tend to get is something that really gets my goat. People measuring exclusion errors against the poverty line and not against the program resources that you have. So if we take the example that we've got here on the slide, imagine a country where you've got 10 million people below the poverty line. You've got enough resources to support 1 million of them through a social protection programme. You end up with an exclusion error here of 9 million people. Now I'd argue that's actually a manipulation of the idea of inclusion and exclusion errors. But people use it to criticise things like proxy means testing. And I think it's an example of a kind of a shoddy misrepresentation of some of the things that are going on with targeting. And I think because people have ideological positions, they do these sorts of things. And I think we need to not do this. Okay, another misrepresentation in terms of exclusion and inclusion errors, getting a little bit more technical now, is something that the World Bank on Indonesia has worked on a lot. I'm going to borrow a little bit from their work here. We tend to give an inclusion error or an exclusion error a single number. 20%, 80%, okay? But what we don't do is look at the distribution of those inclusion and exclusion errors. So where do we find inclusion and exclusion error along the poverty profile or along the income distribution profile? And that doesn't make sense to me, because if poverty and vulnerability are dynamic, people are moving in and out of it all the time, not looking at the distribution of our errors doesn't really make very much sense. So if we look at findings from Ethiopia, my jet lag's kicking in, from Indonesia, over half of the poor every year are newly poor. And a quarter of all Indonesians were poor at some point during the last 3 years. You can see it in the graphs below. And what I really want to point out here is that it matters where in the distribution people are poor. We just worry about the whole of the distribution at the moment. And the question that I'd like to raise is, how much should we worry about people in the fourth consumption decile here? The programmes are only meant to reach people in deciles 1, 2 and 3, but they're reaching people in decile 4. How much should we worry about that? And how much should we worry about reaching people in consumption deciles 8, 9 and 10, the very richest people? Okay? Now I would argue that we shouldn't get too hung up on the people in consumption decile 4, because if they're not poor this year, they're probably going to be poor next year. So should we spend an awful lot of money trying to get them out of programmes, trying to improve our targeting? I don't think so. We do need to worry about the 8, 9s and 10s. And so the amount that we worry about where people are and where our inclusion and exclusion errors are depends on the distribution of income and levels of inequality. And in the next slide, these are aggregated consumption deciles from 5 countries in Africa. This is work that's been done by Frank Ellis, who's on the AusAid Social Protection panel. And what he shows you, what we can see here is that people in the poorest decile their consumption level is about $5.50 a month. People in the 6th decile, so people between 50 and 60%, their consumption's about $10 more than that. So 60% of the population and a difference of $10 in their consumption per month. It's not very much. And it starts to raise some really difficult questions about which of these deciles you're going to target, and is it acceptable only to target the bottom 2? And should you spend a lot of money trying to keep deciles 3, 4, 5 and 6 out of the programme? And I'm just going to show you what Frank says. Frank says, no, you shouldn't. You should support everybody across this distribution. The differences between these poor people are far too small. And one of the things that he does, we call this Frank's Frogs, he shows us what happens if you transfer $2 a month to people in the bottom decile. If you listen very carefully, you can hear frogs. what happens when you do that is that the people who are in the bottom decile move into the second decile. If you transfer $4 a month, listen for the frogs. I can hear them over there. Maybe it's Mike, I'm not sure. You transfer them to somewhere between the third and fourth decile. If you transfer $8 a month, you can hear my frogs now. You move people to somewhere between the fifth and sixth decile. So there are really big implications, particularly at community level, for creating social divisiveness by trying to target really, really explicitly certain percentages of the population. And this stuff matters. And I think I'm just going to go back. The bottom line for me is that it's really, really important to do what is happening in Indonesia, which is explain and describe where your inclusion and exclusion errors are. And people very rarely do that. They just give you a number. And quite often it's a number that shocks us all. Okay, another myth. Targeting can be made administratively simple. I've got two of these. We hear all the time about the fact that targeting is expensive, it's very, very difficult, it's one of the major arguments against it. And one of the things that we try and do is to try and do it in a much simpler way in order to reduce the cost of targeting, in order to do targeting in countries where we might not have a high level of administrative capacity. We do this in a number of ways. And one of them, which I would argue doesn't work, is using basic proxies as an alternative. The work that we've done suggests that using these basic proxies introduces very high levels of inaccuracy into your targeting. It becomes not very effective. And there's some work that Mike Sampson and myself, even though we take very different positions on this debate, have done where we've looked at what happens if you use age proxies or other social categorical proxies to target, to try and reach the poor in 3 countries, Bangladesh, Ghana, and Malawi. And we did a bit of very simple modelling using household income and expenditure survey data. This is the data for Bangladesh. We modelled at 4 different poverty lines just to try and check whether we got different results at different levels of poverty. And basically, I'll just pick out one example for you. So, if we were to use a category which is a female-headed household to try and target poor households in Bangladesh, what would happen? Well, basically, we'd end up with 6 million households that are poor but are not female-headed. So they would not be eligible for the programme. It's not quite the same as an exclusion error or an inclusion error, because that's as much about the administrative process, the implementation. Okay, we would say that households that are not female-headed are not eligible, and we'd miss 6 million poor households if we did that. That's 91% of poor households that we would miss. So not very effective. A blunt instrument, but not very effective in the case of Bangladesh. How many people would we say were eligible who were not poor? 2.35 million households. Okay? So what we find is that there are certain proxies, simple ones, that quite often we say are a really good idea. Let's target grannies, because they've all got orphans in their households. Okay? We say a lot of these things, and actually if we're trying to target poverty, and in particular income poverty, these are not good ways of trying to do it. Okay, the second myth about making targeting administratively more simple, self-targeting. Examples of self-targeting, getting people to select themselves into a programme. There are 3 main ones. One is putting in a public works requirement, so asking people to do labour in return for a usually small wage. The second one's delivering inferior food. In Asia, that tends to be delivering broken rice rather than 90-10 ratio rice. In Africa, it's feeding people yellow maize instead of white maize, and yellow maize in Africa is seen as animal food and not food for humans. And so the idea is that only the poor will want to eat that kind of food, and only the poor will join your programme. And then also making people's participation in the programme really time-consuming, so that they don't want to do it. So if you have to queue up for 3 days to try and go and get all the paperwork in order to join the programme, and then you have to queue up like these Somali women are doing on the right-hand side for hours and hours and hours in order to get a small carton of food, you won't do it if you're rich. So that's the principle of self-targeting. Does it work in practice? No, not really. And in particular, it doesn't work where you've got high levels of poverty across the population. And so you may have, for example, in Indonesia, a relatively low level of poverty, but in some districts or in some communities it's very, very high, and self-selection will not work in those situations. It can also have really negative impacts on your program and the impacts that you're trying to have. So if you're trying to waste a lot of people's time in order to try and filter out rich people, you're wasting poor people's time, and that means they're spending less time trying to do other things to generate a livelihood. You're probably going to make them more dependent on social protection, not less dependent. And then finally, one thing that I think is really important, the question of whether it's morally or ethically acceptable to self-target in these kinds of ways. Should poor people be expected to consume poorer quality food than anybody else? Is it okay to leave them queuing up for perhaps days on end in order to try is it acceptable to waste their time in order to try and get some people to decide they don't want to be in the programme? I'd argue not, and I'd argue that the ideology starts to come through here, and that actually when we self-target, it tells us something about how we feel about poor people. It perhaps tells us we think they're second-class citizens. Or it perhaps tells us that even though we're working really, really hard at poverty reduction, we don't really like poor people very much. So I'm very, very sceptical about self-targeting, but I also think it doesn't work. You can't make a programme administratively more simple using it. Another myth, one that came up a lot this week, we've been talking with an AusAid Gender and Women's Empowerment Programme, MAMPU, and talking to CSOs there. The myth that if we target women in our programmes, we are tackling gender. And I think there's a lot of tick boxing happens in social protection. As soon as we've got a quota for the number of women beneficiaries, we say, oh, yeah, tick, off we go, gender. We can report back to our headquarters and say we've done it. Okay. Well, what's the story? Well, you can have a sort of an affirmative action type impact by targeting women in social protection programs. So women who would have been excluded, wouldn't have even known about the program, sometimes are then involved in programming because people have to go out and find them and seek beneficiaries in that way. But those impacts are really very limited, and actually targeting women in this way is usually quite gender blind. If you look at things, what we tend to find is that it traps them in traditional roles. It doesn't help them break out of the fact that it's women who were responsible for childcare or women who were responsible for health within the family. And it also tends to mean that we make women responsible for conditions in conditional cash transfer programs, not men. So women take the burden of participation in programs. So overall, very limited situations in which targeting women really has a transformative effect or really tackles structural inequalities. And I'd like to see a conditional cash transfer program that says that men are responsible for taking babies to be inoculated at clinics. Because then we'd really start changing ideas about what's men's work and what's women's work. Okay? But the bottom line, targeting women does not tick the box on gender-sensitive programming. It's a myth, don't do it. You need to do much, much better if you really want to tackle gender. Okay, 2 misrepresentations in one slide here. The first one, targeting is cost-effective because it channels more resources to the poor and vulnerable. We hear that a lot, right? The second one, I hear all the time when we do job interviews at ODI, targeting actually costs so much that it's cheaper to do a universal program. And when we get told this in job interviews at ODI, we go, oh, okay. What's the evidence for that? Tell us where that comes from. And people can't. They can't tell us the evidence for those kinds of assertions and statements. So which of them is correct? The answer is we don't know. Occasionally, in specific places, we might have an answer to the question. But the real issue here is that the answer will change for different countries, different programs, different social protection systems. So don't ever try and seek out an answer about whether universal or targeted is better. Okay, there isn't an answer to that question. It depends where you are, what you're doing, and so on. And then finally, and this is my last one, misrepresentation that some targeting approaches are better than others. We have this constant argument about, should we do community-based targeting? Should we do geographic? Should we do proxy means testing? Should we do means testing? It goes on and on and on. And basically, the key evidence on this, which we've actually had for a long, long time, is that the variance in targeting performance is within targeting mechanisms or tools and not between them. Okay? So within community-based targeting, we get sometimes examples of it being very, very effective, and we get examples of it performing terribly. Within proxy means testing, we get examples of it doing really, really well and examples of it doing really, really badly. So we can't say that one kind of targeting is better than another, and we should stop looking for the perfect targeting mechanism. And there are a few reasons for this. One of them, targeting design is important, but it also depends heavily on two things. One is what kind of program you're implementing. There are lots of different kinds of social protection programs, and some targeting mechanisms work better in some programs than others. But also that it is all about implementation at the end of the day. And this distinction that I made between the decision that you make about who is eligible versus the action of actually trying to find people is critical here. Because quite often we're not very good at implementing our targeting. We're not very good at doing the finding people bit. And so I want to finish with a quote. A really great piece of work on targeting that weighed up the evidence that we have, and this bit still holds true today. It's David Cody, Margaret Quash and John Hoddenott back in 2004. They've updated this piece of work a few times, but they say two things to us. One is that if you're trying to understand what explains variation in targeting performance, grouping by your targeting method, so comparing whether it was community-based, geographic, proxy means testing, or something else, explains only 20% of the variation that we see in performance on targeting. And then secondly, no matter how well you choose between different targeting designs or tools, the effectiveness of implementation is actually the key factor in what you're going to achieve. So that was my last one, and thank you very much.